Botanical gardens, they're not just museums for plants. That is to say, many botanical gardens serve a public recreation and educational purpose, but they aren't only pretty places to go for a visit and take a walk in. They're sites of research and conservation in their own right. But according to a new paper in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, our efforts to conserve wild plant life may be inadvertently hurting our ability to maintain the diversity of those living botanical collections, which in turn loops right back and hurts our efforts to conserve wild plant life. There are few different ways that botanists and horticulturalists maintain botanical collections. There are seed banks, which are pretty much what they sound like, collections of seeds. There are herbaria, which collect preserved specimens. This is a 17th century little herbarium book, and while those kind of collections have changed a little since then, actually the core idea remains remarkably intact. Then there are botanical gardens, where you're not dealing with seeds that will one day grow into plant. You're not dealing with preserved plants that no longer do plant things. You're dealing with real living organisms that respond to the environment, grow, wither, propagate, and so on, making it the most dynamic, changeable type of botanical collection. Obviously, that makes these gardens a substantially more interesting place to visit than a seed bank, an experience you could replicate by stepping into a particularly large pantry. But to have a living collection, that also means you gotta keep those plants alive. Now, I'm terrible at keeping plants alive, but there are people for whom that's the whole job, they love it, and more power to them. But even the most green thumb eventually has to swap out and replace these plants as their lifespan comes to an end. When that happens, you, a horticulturalist, only have two places to get a new plant to maintain the size and diversity of your collection. You can get a new horticultural sample from a living collection, a seed bank, etc., or you can get a new plant from the wild. Now, I was taught not to pick flowers, but these are professionals, and it's literally where these collections' diversity come from. Living botanical collections worldwide collectively have 30% of all land plant species, over 100,000 species of plant. We use these plants to do a bunch of science. When you want to do experiments like RNA sequencing citrus fruits to discover what genes make oranges taste orange, botanical collections have dozens of different sweet oranges, hardy oranges, and tangerines that can be samples for comparison. If you want to understand phylogenetic relationships between different plant species, like whether a bitter orange is a citrus. It's not, apparently. You need samples from all those closely related species to tease apart their genetic relationships. And where seed banks and herbaria provide a snapshot of what those plants were like when the sample was gathered, even many decades ago, living collections, especially those with lots of plants direct from the wild, reflect how those plants are responding to the environment now, which is more important than ever as global plant life adapts in response to climate change. That touches on the last super crucial point of living collections, its role in conservation for at-risk or endangered plant species. 20% of the world's plant diversity is threatened with extinction, but fully 40% of those globally threatened species are available in living plant collections. Diverse, representative collections from botanical gardens are often a source of plants to reintroduce to the wild and bolster endangered plant species. So, if we want our little plant libraries to have the widest possible selection of plants, and for those plants to be representative of wild plants so that our science reflects real-world plant life, and so our reintroduction efforts with samples from botanical collections aren't doing the plant equivalent of reintroducing pugs to a wolf habitat. The problem is, our botanical collections aren't quite as diverse or representative as they used to be, at least in aggregate. See, in this article, our researchers looked at the collective samples of 50 worldwide botanical collections. A meta-collection, kind of like how art museums network so that a painting in San Francisco can be sent over to a museum in Rome or something. Our scientists charted the meta-collection over the last 100 years to see how the sample library had grown and changed over time. The 20th century, it turns out, was a big time for collections, at least in total numbers of samples, but the peak was back around 2007. The fact that collections peaked in the first place is pretty interesting. Even more interesting, perhaps, is that the phylogenetic diversity of these plant collections peaked even earlier. Looking at those samples, while the total number of data points in the white dots this time, and the orange data points as a percentage of maximum diversity of these plant collections, that peaked way back in 1990, even though these collections continued to grow after that by another 25%. If these were libraries, it's like our collections have more books, but it's more copies of the same book. How did we lose genetic diversity in our plant collections? Well, our botanical gardens don't get new wild plants anymore. You can see in the early 90s there's a sharp drop in samples in new wild plants. You know, the ones that ensure that our collections are representative of plants out in the world. We can see that the rise in new samples came from garden plants, primarily, which is apparently around the time wild plants peaked as a percentage of living collections. But while we're looking at this plot, there's one other thing worth seeing. That CBD with an arrow right at the peak wild. What the heck, in this context, is CBD? The Convention on Biological Diversity. 196 states are members of this UN convention, and 137 countries have ratified the relevant Nagoya Protocol, although it is prominently missing at least one UN member state. The idea was that the benefit of genetic resources and biodiversity should be shared fairly, and equitably, and for national governments that ratified this convention to create legal frameworks for access and benefit sharing for that biodiversity. The goal, basically, is to protect global biodiversity from colonizing and commercial plundering. And that makes a lot of sense in the context of other supplementary protocols in this agreement, like the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which focuses on genetically modified organisms and biotechnology, as well as the underlying motivations for the convention. When corporations come into local communities and patent their resources and traditional knowledge, as with biopiracy or bioprospecting, maybe you don't want your own plant extract sold back to you in markup. And in the context of practices like that, your biological and technological distinctiveness will become our own. Yeah, of course there's going to be a global appetite for agreements to ensure that biodiversity and genetic resources are shared equitably. But within the access and benefit sharing framework, there aren't distinctions between commercial and academic research, including biodiversity researchers and conservationists. It's been a subject of concern among scientists for decades as permits to get samples became harder to come by. And what this new study shows us is that there ended up being a notable chilling effect for botanical collections, which again are really important for studying genetic diversity in plants and for conserving it. Now, these data could too easily be taken in an environmental treaty bad sort of way. But the thing is, that's not the take from the actual researchers, who, remember, professionally care about plant diversity for a living. They are on board with the goals of this convention. When the authors interpret the data in the discussion, what they see is a peak for older, larger collections which are hitting capacity constraints. Okay, fair enough. I mean, Stardew Valley taught me I can only water so many plants in a single day. Smaller botanical collections can't fully compensate for those trends, and they don't have the same diversity as larger collections right now. But they are more often near biodiversity hotspots, which, as these researchers point out, allows them to perhaps avoid permitting issues. While it's clearly gotten harder to get samples of global plants, and while we've seen what that does to our collections of wild plants, we also see a compensatory increase in new samples of native plants. When these new accessions are gathered for collections in biodiversity hotspots, that may help fulfill both scientists' and policymakers' goals for biodiversity. And that's a lot to unpack, given that when I started all this, I thought botanical gardens were only like this kind of thing. Brought to you by the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh. That just goes to show that, like any other collection, like libraries and like museums, there's the stuff that we, the public, see, but there's so much more going on behind the surface for people who dedicate their lives to these collections. So, plant librarians, I'm on your team now.